Sometimes life kicks you when you're already down and all you can do is keep standing. Thomas Harper knew that feeling well. At 55, he'd lost his job. His savings were running dry and his daughter barely returned his calls anymore. One afternoon at the county fair, he bought a $5 raffle ticket for an old abandoned farm. Not because he thought he'd win, but because he had nothing better to do. When they called his name, people laughed. The farm was a wreck, everyone knew it. But Thomas took the keys anyway. When he walked into that dusty farmhouse and started looking around, he found something hidden in the walls. Something that would change everything. The fairground lights flickered against the darkening Missouri sky as Jerry Stokes, owner of the local feed store, grabbed the microphone with the enthusiasm of a man who'd had 3 beers and felt generous about it. The crowd had thinned to maybe 200 people, most of them locals killing time before the fireworks started. Thomas sat on a bench near the parking lot watching a family pack their minivan with prizes and tired children not really paying attention to anything except the hollow feeling in his chest that had become his constant companion. The announcement crackled through the cheap speakers. Grand prize winner, ticket number 47,219, Thomas Harper. The name didn't register at first. He'd bought the tickets on impulse, 5 crumpled dollars that probably should have gone toward groceries. Then he checked the thin strip of paper in his pocket, and the numbers matched, and suddenly people were looking at him with expressions that weren't quite congratulations. More like pity mixed with amusement. He walked back to the main tent, feeling every one of his 55 years in the ache of his knees. Jerry beamed at him like they were old friends, which they weren't. Jerry had been one of the guys at the warehouse who got promoted to management before the whole place shut down. He'd landed on his feet. Thomas hadn't. "Congratulations, Thomas." Jerry fumbled with a manila envelope, his face flushed. "You're now the proud owner of the old Blackwell farm. 40 acres, house, barn, the whole works." Applause rippled through the crowd, but underneath it, Thomas heard the whispers. "Poor bastard. Place is worthless. Roof's probably caved in by now. That whole property is cursed if you ask me." Nobody asked. Thomas took the envelope, shook Jerry's damp hand, and walked away. He sat in his car in the parking lot until the fairgrounds emptied and the fireworks painted the sky in colors that felt like they belonged to someone else's celebration. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes promises the day can't keep. Thomas drove out to rural Route 12 in his 12-year-old sedan, the engine making a sound it hadn't made before another problem he couldn't afford to fix. The driveway was almost invisible, choked with weeds and saplings that scraped against his doors with fingernail sounds. The house appeared gradually through the overgrowth, 2 stories of white paint peeling like sunburned skin. Black shutters hung at drunken angles. The barn listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Thomas parked and got out into silence so complete it felt oppressive. Just wind moving through tall grass and somewhere far off a crow complaining about something only crows understood. He walked to the front porch, tested the steps. They held. The key turned in the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open onto a smell that was part must, part time, part abandonment. The furniture was still there, which surprised him. A sofa with cushions that had given up. A kitchen table with chairs tucked in, like someone had just left for a moment and never came back. Dust covered everything like a shroud. Thomas walked through slowly, his footsteps loud in the stillness. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub stained by decades of dripping water. Downstairs, a kitchen with appliances that belonged in a museum, and a living room dominated by a stone fireplace that looked like it had been built to last centuries. In the kitchen drawer nearest the sink, buried under dish towels that disintegrated at his touch, he found a photograph. Black and white, curled at the edges. A man in his 60s standing beside some kind of machine, wearing work clothes and an expression of quiet satisfaction. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Edward 2018. Thomas studied the face. Intelligent eyes, a slight smile like he knew something the camera didn't. This was Edward Blackwell then. The man who'd owned this place, who'd died here, or near here, who'd left behind 40 acres nobody wanted except now Thomas owned it. He slipped the photo into his pocket and looked around the kitchen again. The place needed work. Everything needed work. But it had bones, as his wife would have said. She'd always seen potential where Thomas saw problems. Standing in that dusty kitchen with afternoon light slanting through dirty windows, Thomas made a decision he couldn't quite explain even to himself. He had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. His apartment lease expired in 30 days, and the landlord had already made it clear there wouldn't be a renewal. The farm was his, worthless or not. He might as well see what he'd won. That evening he called Emma. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, Dad, what's up? I'm actually in the middle of something." "I won a farm," Thomas said. "At the county fair. I won a farm and a raffle." A pause. "You what? At the county fair, the raffle? I won the old Blackwell place out on rural Route 12. Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, is it worth anything?" "Probably not, but I'm going to move there." "Move there, Dad, you can't be serious. You need to focus on finding work, not playing farmer." "I'm not playing anything. I'll figure out the work situation. I just wanted to let you know." He could hear her frustration, could picture her in her apartment in St. Louis with its modern furniture in view of the city. "This seems really impulsive. Can we talk about this?" "Maybe I can drive down this weekend." "You don't need to do that." "I'm fine. I'll call you once I'm settled." They said goodbye, Emma still protesting, Thomas already mentally packing what little he had left. After he hung up, he sat in his apartment and looked at the photograph of Edward Blackwell again. The man stared back across the years, that slight smile suggesting secrets Thomas couldn't begin to guess. Thomas moved into the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning, his entire life fitting into the back of his sedan. 3 boxes of clothes, above kitchen supplies, another of books and papers, in a duffel bag with his laptop and the few photographs he couldn't bear to leave behind. It took one trip from the car to the house, and when he set the last box down in the living room, the emptiness of the space seemed to mock the smallness of his possessions. He spent the first day cleaning. The work felt good, purposeful, measurable. He scrubbed counters, swept floors, wiped down windows until they let in light that hadn't touched these rooms in years. By evening, the house looked almost livable. He made a sandwich from groceries he'd bought in Miller Springs, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and watched the sun set over fields that now belonged to him. That night, the house spoke to him in creaks and groans, the language of old woods, settling of wind, finding gaps in the siding of a structure, remembering what it meant to shelter someone. Thomas lay upstairs on an air mattress he'd inflated with a hand pump, listening to the symphony of small sounds, and found it oddly comforting. The apartment had been silent except for muffled sounds of neighbors he never met. Here the silence had texture. The second morning he began exploring in earnest. The bedroom where he'd slept had a closet with wire hangers and a shelf holding folded linens that smelled of mothballs and time. The other bedroom was smaller, painted a faded yellow, empty, except for a desk pushed against one wall. Thomas opened the desk drawers one by one. The first 2 were empty. The third stuck, and when he worked it free, he found a leather-bound journal wedged at an angle. The journal was thick, the leather worn soft by handling. He carried it downstairs to the kitchen, where the light was better, poured himself coffee from the pot he'd made, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was precise, each letter carefully formed. March 15th, 1995. Started today on what might be the most important work of my life. They'll say I'm crazy. They already do. But I know this can work. The mathematics are sound. The principles are solid. What I lack in formal credentials I make up for in stubbornness and time. Plenty of both. Thomas turned pages reading entries that spanned years. Edward wrote about his work, about setbacks and small victories, about long nights in his workshop, and the satisfaction of solving problems that had seemed impossible. The entries were technical, in places filled with equations and sketches that Thomas didn't fully understand, but between the mathematics was something else. A voice. A man talking to himself, to the future, to anyone who might one day care. One entry, dated September 2003, caught his attention. Went to town today for supplies. Charlie at the hardware store gave me that look again. The one that says he thinks I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am. But when you've been laughed at as long as I have, you learn to use it as fuel. They laughed at me in school. They laughed when I told them I could fix anything. They're still laughing now that I'm trying to build something that matters. Let them laugh. I'll keep working. Thomas read the words twice, felt something shift inside him. He knew that look. He'd seen it at the county fair, heard it in the whispers. The pity mixed with amusement. the dismissal that came so easily to people who'd never been dismissed themselves. He kept reading. The entries grew more focused as the years progressed, centered on something Edward called the converter. He mentioned prototypes, tests, failures, adjustments. He wrote about the moment he realized he was close, really close to something that could change lives. The last entry was dated November 2019, just months before Edward died. So tired now. The work is nearly done, but I'm running out of time. Can feel it in my bones the way winter feels when you've lived through enough of them. If I don't finish, someone else will have to. The plans are all here, the pieces are all here. Just need someone who believes enough to put them together. That's all any of us need, really. Someone who believes. Thomas closed the journal carefully, his coffee forgotten and cold. He looked around the kitchen, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just an abandoned house, it was Edward's home. His workshop was here somewhere, and in it, the work of a lifetime waited for someone who believed enough to finish it. He thought about calling Emma, telling her about the journal, but stopped himself. She'd already made her opinion clear. This was a distraction, a waste of time. Another example of her father refusing to face reality. She wouldn't understand that sometimes reality was exactly what you needed to escape. Instead, Thomas took the journal and walked outside. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, its doors closed, its windows dark. He'd avoided it so far, put off by the visible decay, but now he walked toward it with purpose. The main doors were secured with a padlock crusted with rust. Thomas tried the key ring that had come with the deed. The third key fit, and after some effort, the lock opened. He pulled the doors wide, and afternoon sunlight spilled into darkness. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside. The floor was concrete, cracked but mostly solid. Old hay bales were stacked along one wall. A tractor sat in the corner, tires flat, covered in dust. Tools hung on pegboards, their outlines visible, even beneath years of cobwebs. At the back of the barn, behind a wall of hay bales that looked deliberately placed, Thomas found another door. This one was secured with a newer padlock, and none of his keys fit. He searched the barn for something to break it with, found a heavy wrench, and struck the lock 3 times before it gave way. The door opened into a workshop that took Thomas's breath away. Workbenches lined 3 walls, their surfaces covered with tools, organized with obvious care. Blueprints were tacked to the walls, dozens of them, showing mechanical drawings and electrical schematics. In the center of the room on the main workbench sat a device covered with a canvas tarp. Thomas approached slowly, his pulse quickening. He grasped the tarp and pulled it away. The device was beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Copper coils wound with perfect precision. Metal components fitted together with the patience of someone who measured success in millimeters. It was incomplete. He could see that. Wires hung loose. Certain sections were obviously missing parts. But the craftsmanship was stunning, the work of someone who cared deeply about every detail. Thomas found more blueprints rolled and stored in metal tubes. He spread one across an empty section of workbench and studied it. Blackwell Energy Converter Prototype A was written across the top in that same precise handwriting. Below it, dense technical drawings showed how the components fit together, how energy flowed through the system, what outputs could be expected. He didn't understand all of it, most of it, honestly, but he understood enough. Edward had been building something important, something that generated power, that could work independently, that represented years of thought and effort and belief. Thomas looked at the device, at the blueprints, at the workshop filled with the tools and dreams of a man who died thinking himself a failure. The town had laughed at Edward, just like they'd laughed at Thomas. Dismissed him, overlooked him, never bothered to see what he was actually doing out here. Standing in that workshop with pale sunlight filtering through grimy windows, Thomas made a promise to a dead man he'd never met. He would understand this work. He would learn what Edward had been trying to do. And if it was possible, if it was even remotely possible, he would finish it. Thomas spent the next 3 weeks living between 2 worlds. Mornings belonged to house repairs that couldn't wait, basic maintenance that made the place livable. He fixed the leaking faucet in the kitchen, replaced broken window panes, patched holes in the walls where weather had found its way inside. The work was familiar, the kind of practical problem-solving he'd done his whole life. Afternoons and evenings belonged to the workshop. He started by cleaning, removing years of accumulated dust and debris, organizing the tools, creating inventory lists of what was there. Edward had been methodical. Every drawer was labeled. Every tool had its place. As Thomas restored that order, he felt like he was getting to know the man through his habits. The blueprints became his textbooks. He photographed each one with his phone-printed copies at the library in Miller Springs, spread them across the kitchen table where he could study them over coffee. The designs were complex but not incomprehensible. Edward had included notes in the margins, explanations, calculations, reminders to himself. Thomas read them like letters from a patient teacher. His warehouse experience helped more than he'd expected. He understood how things fit together, how weight distributed, how systems needed to be balanced. What he didn't understand, he researched. His laptop became a portal to engineering forums, tutorial videos, articles about energy generation and mechanical design. He learned the language slowly, one term at a time. The device itself was remarkable up close. The copper coils were the heart of it, thousands of precise windings that must have taken months to complete. Thomas found Edward's notes about them, entries in the journal describing failed attempts, breakthrough moments, the satisfaction of finally achieving the exact specifications needed. The coils alone represented years of work. Other components were easier to understand. A housing that protected the internal mechanisms. A control panel with gauges and switches. Connection points for power output. The whole thing was designed to be functional, not decorative. Every piece served a purpose. Nothing wasted. What was missing became clear as Thomas studied both the device and the blueprints. Certain electrical components weren't installed. Specific sections showed gaps where parts should be. On one blueprint, Edward had circled items in red ink and written need beside them with increasing urgency. Thomas made his own list. Specialized capacitors, specific gauge wiring, a voltage regulator with particular specifications. Some items he recognized from his warehouse days. Others were foreign technical components he'd have to research to even understand their function. The financial reality couldn't be ignored. His unemployment benefits covered basic expenses, food utilities for the farmhouse, gas for his car. There was nothing left over for parts that cost hundreds of dollars. Thomas lay awake nights doing mathematics that never balanced, trying to figure out how to fund a project he couldn't justify to anyone, including himself. On a Thursday morning, he swallowed his pride and drove to Kellerman's Hardware in town. The store occupied a building that had probably started life as something else. High ceilings and exposed bricks suggested old money and different times. Now it smelled like sawdust and motor oil, familiar scents that eased something in Thomas's chest. Frank Kellerman stood behind the counter, a man in his 60s with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He looked up as Thomas entered, recognition crossing his face. "Thomas Harper, heard you won the Blackwell place. How's that working out for you?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "It's a project, keeping me busy." Frank nodded slowly, the kind of nod that said he'd heard the real answer underneath. "What brings you in?" "Actually, I was wondering if you might need help. Part-time, whatever you've got. I've got experience with inventory shipping, general labor." Frank studied him for a long moment. Thomas kept his expression neutral, refused to let desperation show, even though they both knew it was there. "You know which end of a hammer to hold, I do. Can you start Monday, 3 days a week, 6 hours a day? Pay's not great, but there's an employee discount." Relief washed through Thomas like cool water. "That works. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. It's real work. Stocking shelves, helping customers, unloading trucks when they come. You'll earn every dollar. I'm not afraid of real work." Frank smiled, then the first genuine warmth Thomas had seen from anyone in town since he'd won the farm. "No, I don't imagine you are." Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Thomas left the hardware store feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Useful. The job wouldn't solve all his problems, but it would help. The employee discount especially. He could buy the parts he needed gradually, piece by piece, building toward completion, the same way Edward had built the device itself, with patience and persistence. That weekend, he had an unexpected visitor. Thomas was working in the front yard clearing brush from around the porch when a car pulled up the driveway. An older woman emerged, moving carefully, using a cane for balance. She wore a cardigan despite the warm afternoon and had white hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Hello there," she called. "You must be Thomas." Thomas set down his rake and walked over. "That's right, I'm Phyllis Drexel. I live about 2 miles down the road. Thought I'd come introduce myself, see how you're settling in." That's kind of you. Would you like to come inside? I can make coffee. I'd like that very much. Inside, Thomas poured coffee while Phyllis looked around the kitchen with eyes that clearly remembered it differently. She ran her hand along the counter, a gesture that was almost affectionate. I knew Edward, she said quietly. Not well, but we were neighbors for 30 years. My husband used to help him sometimes with metalwork. Edward would come over with drawings, ask questions about how to shape certain pieces, what tools to use. Thomas set a cup in front of her, sat down across the table. What was he like? Brilliant. Kind. Terribly lonely, I think, though he never complained. Phyllis sipped her coffee. People in town thought he was strange. Maybe he was, but strange isn't the same as bad. He was just focused on something the rest of us couldn't see. His work, Thomas said. Yes, he talked about it sometimes. Making something that could help people. Something that would prove he'd done something worthwhile with his life. She looked at Thomas with eyes that saw more than he'd intended to show. You found his workshop, didn't you? Thomas nodded slowly. Are you going to finish what he started? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas thought about lying, deflecting, but something in Phyllis's expression said she deserved honesty. I'm trying to understand it. Whether I can finish it, I don't know yet. Phyllis smiled. Edward would be glad someone's trying. He died thinking it was all for nothing, that he'd wasted his life on something nobody would ever see or care about. She reached across the table and patted Thomas's hand. You prove him wrong, and you'll be giving an old man the peace he never got to feel while he was alive. Before she left, Phyllis wrote her phone number on a scrap of paper. My husband's old workshop is in our barn. Tools, equipment, some specialized things he collected over the years. You need anything, you come ask. Edward helped us more times than I can count. Least I can do is help someone helping him. After she left, Thomas sat on the porch and watched the sun drop toward the horizon. The farm stretched out before him. 40 acres of possibility or foolishness, depending on who you asked. The barn held secrets he was only beginning to understand. The journal beside him contained the thoughts of a man who died too soon alone, believing himself a failure. Thomas thought about his daughter, about the widening distance between them, about his empty apartment and the warehouse job that had defined him for a quarter century, about all the ways life had slowly eroded his sense of purpose until winning a worthless farm at a county fair felt like the best thing that had happened to him in years. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe he was wasting time on a dead man's impossible dream. But for the first time since his wife died, since Emma stopped calling, since the warehouse closed its doors, Thomas felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from everything else. In the workshop, Edward's device waited in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, Thomas would return to it, would try to understand one more circuit, solve one more problem, take one more step toward completing work that had consumed a stranger's life. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was something to believe in. The hardware store became Thomas's anchor to the practical world. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, from 8 to 2, he stocked shelves, helped customers find what they needed, unloaded delivery trucks. The work was simple, almost meditative. Frank turned out to be a fair boss, patient with customers and generous with knowledge. When business was slow, he'd show Thomas different tools, explain their uses, share tricks learned over 40 years in the trade. The other employees warmed to Thomas gradually. There was Mark, a younger man who handled the lumberyard, and Patricia, who managed the front counter and seemed to know every customer by name. They included Thomas in their coffee breaks, their small talk about weather and local gossip. He didn't contribute much, but he listened, and that seemed to be enough. Customers were a different matter. Some ignored him completely. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A few asked about the farm with barely concealed curiosity. What was he doing out there? Was he planning to sell? Had he found anything interesting? Thomas's answers were vague and polite. The workshop remained his secret, Edward's legacy, something he wasn't ready to expose to judgment or ridicule. His paychecks were modest, but the employee discount made them stretch further. Each week he bought a few components from his list. A voltage regulator, one week specialized wiring the next. Gradually, the gaps in Edward's device began to fill. The work was painstaking. Each connection verified against the blueprints, each component tested before permanent installation. The journal became his companion. Thomas read it in the evenings, sitting in the kitchen with coffee, learning not just about the device, but about the man who'd built it. Edward wrote about his childhood, about being the kid who took things apart to see how they worked, who fixed neighbors' broken radios and lawnmowers, who dreamed of inventing something that mattered. He'd never married. The journal mentioned a woman once briefly. Sarah said, "I care more about machines than people." Maybe she's right. Maybe that's why I'm better with machines. There was loneliness in those entries, carefully controlled, but impossible to miss. Edward had traded human connection for his work, and the journal suggested he'd wondered if that was the right choice. Thomas understood that isolation better than he wanted to admit. His phone calls with Emma had dwindled to brief text messages. She'd ask how he was doing. He'd say fine. She'd mention being busy with work. The conversations felt like obligations neither of them enjoyed, but both felt compelled to maintain. 6 weeks after moving to the farm, Thomas found something that changed everything. He'd been organizing a cabinet in the workshop, moving old tools and supplies when he noticed the back panel didn't sit flush against the wall. When he pulled it forward, a metal lockbox tumbled out, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The box was secured with a combination lock. Thomas tried obvious numbers. Edward's birth year, the year he'd bought the farm, simple sequences. Nothing worked. He was about to set it aside when he remembered something from the journal. Edward had mentioned his mother's birthday once, noting how she'd always believed in him, even when no one else did. Thomas found the entry, calculated the date as a 6-digit number, and tried it. The lock opened. Inside were papers and letters, mostly organized in chronological order with rubber bands. Thomas carried the box to the workbench and began reading. The first letter was dated 2003, addressed to Dr. Helen Waverly at the State University Engineering Department. Edward's letter introduced himself and his work. He described the energy converter, explained the principles behind it, asked if Dr. Waverly might review his calculations. The tone was humble but confident, a man who knew his ideas were sound but wanted expert validation. Dr. Waverly's response came 2 weeks later. She was intrigued, asked for more details, offered encouragement. Thus began a correspondence that spanned several years. The letter showed a collaboration developing. Waverly provided feedback on Edward's designs, suggested refinements, helped him understand complex engineering principles he'd taught himself imperfectly. Thomas read through the exchanges, watching the device evolve on paper, seeing how Edward's raw innovation combined with Waverly's formal training to create something better than either could have achieved alone. There was excitement in the letters, the shared thrill of pursuing something genuinely new. Then the tone shifted. A letter from Edward dated 2007 mentioned preparing a patent application. He'd documented everything, had the working prototype nearly complete, felt ready to formalize his invention. Dr. Waverly's response was encouraging. She offered to review the application to provide supporting documentation from their correspondence. The next letter in the stack wasn't from Waverly. It was from the State University Office of Legal Affairs. Thomas read it twice, his stomach tightening with each pass. The letter informed Edward that his proposed patent covered technology substantially similar to research being conducted at the university. It suggested his application might constitute infringement on intellectual property developed through university-funded programs. It strongly advised him to consult with legal counsel before proceeding. There were 3 patent rejection letters after that, each citing different technical reasons, but all concluding the same way. Application denied. The language was dense, bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Edward's invention was too similar to existing research. He couldn't prove independent development. His claims lacked sufficient differentiation. The final letter in the stack was from Dr. Waverly. It was brief, apologetic, devastating. She'd been instructed by her department head to cease all communication with outside inventors. Her research was university property. She couldn't provide documentation supporting Edward's patent claim. She wished him well but couldn't help him further. On the bottom of that letter in Edward's handwriting were 3 words. They stole it. Thomas sat back from the workbench, his mind racing. He pulled out his laptop and searched for the State University Engineering Department. Their website featured prominent sections on energy research, sustainable power generation, breakthrough innovations in renewable technology. The descriptions sounded remarkably familiar, concepts Edward had written about in his journal systems described in the letters to Dr. Waverly. He found Dr. Waverly's faculty page. She was now a full professor, her biography listing numerous publications in energy systems design. Her research had received substantial grant funding. She'd won awards for innovation in sustainable technology. Thomas searched for patents held by the university. He found three related to energy generation systems, all filed between 2008 and 2010. The technical descriptions were complex, but the core concepts matched what he'd learned from Edwards' blueprints. The devices described in the patents weren't identical to Edwards' design, but they were clearly derived from the same foundational ideas. The patents listed multiple inventors. Dr. Waverly was among them. So was someone named Dr. Bernard Ashton, identified as the department head. Thomas returned to the letters, read them again with new understanding. Edward had shared everything with Dr. Waverly. His calculations, his designs, his breakthrough insights. She'd helped him refine them, had access to every detail. Then when Edward tried to formalize his claim, the university had shut him down and filed their own patents using knowledge they'd gained from him. It was theft dressed in legal language and institutional authority. Edward had been too isolated, too trusting, too naive about how the world worked. He'd believed in collaboration in the shared pursuit of knowledge. They'd used that belief against him. Thomas thought about Edward's final journal entries, the exhaustion and defeat in those words. The man had died thinking he'd failed, that his life's work had been for nothing. He'd never known that his ideas had succeeded, just not in his name, not with his recognition, not in any way that gave him credit for what he'd created. The injustice of it burned inside Thomas. He looked at the device on the workbench, at the blueprints on the walls, at the journal, filled with a dead man's dreams. Edward Blackwell had been brilliant. He'd invented something genuinely important, and he'd been robbed by people who had the power to take what he'd created and make it their own. Thomas stood and walked to the barn doors, looked out at the farm in the fading light. He'd come here with nothing, no job, no purpose, no hope. He'd found Edward's work and thought maybe he could finish it, could complete what another man had started. Now he understood the real challenge wasn't technical. The device could be finished. The harder question was what to do with it once it was done. If he revealed the working prototype with the university claim, would they say it infringed on their patents demand, he cease and desist, bury it in legal proceedings? Would anyone believe that a self-taught mechanic had invented it first, that the university's celebrated research was built on stolen foundations? Thomas didn't know. But standing there in the workshop, surrounded by evidence of both genius and betrayal, he made a decision. He would finish the device. He would document everything. And then he would find a way to tell Edward's story, to give the man the recognition that had been stolen from him. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But Edward deserved someone to fight for him, even if that fight came 5 years too late. Thomas spent the next week in a state of controlled anger. He went to work at the hardware store, smiled at customers, stocked shelves, maintained the facade of normalcy. But his mind was elsewhere, churning through possibilities, calculating risks, trying to figure out how to expose what had been done to Edward without destroying any chance of justice. The device was nearly complete. He'd installed the final electrical components, connected the systems, according to Edward's blueprints, double-checked every connection. All that remained was testing, seeing if 30 years of work and belief would actually produce the results Edward had promised. On a Saturday morning with clouds gathering overhead and rain threatening, Thomas prepared for the first real test. He'd reviewed the startup procedures a dozen times, understood the sequence of steps, knew what measurements to watch. The workshop felt charged with anticipation, as if Edward himself was watching from somewhere beyond. Thomas flipped the main power switch. The device hummed to life, a sound that started low and built gradually. The copper coils began to spin, barely visible movement at first, then faster. Gauges on the control panel flickered and steadied. Numbers appeared on the digital display, voltage, amperage, frequency, all climbing toward the ranges Edward had predicted. The system stabilized. Thomas checked the output meter. The device was generating power. Clean, consistent power from minimal input. The conversion ratio exceeded anything he'd seen in commercial systems. It worked. After all the doubt, all the setbacks, all the years Edward had spent alone in this workshop, it actually worked. Thomas stood there watching the gauges hold steady and felt something break open inside him. Joy mixed with grief, triumph shadowed by loss. Edward should have been here for this moment. He should have seen his life's work validated, should have felt this vindication. Instead, he died believing he'd failed, never knowing how close he'd come, never getting the recognition he deserved. Thomas ran the device for an hour, monitoring every system, taking measurements, documenting everything with photos and videos. The performance remained consistent, the output steady. There were no fluctuations, no signs of stress. The engineering was sound, the design was brilliant. Edward Blackwell had built something revolutionary, and the world had never known. After shutting down the system, Thomas sat at the workbench with his laptop and began researching in earnest. He needed to understand patent law, intellectual property rights, what recourse might exist for theft that occurred years ago. The reading was dense and discouraging. Proving the university had stolen Edward's ideas would require documentation, expert testimony, resources Thomas didn't have. But he had the letters, he had the journals, he had the device itself built years before the university filed their patents. That had to count for something. Thomas thought about Dr. Helen Waverly, tried to imagine the woman behind the faculty photo on the university website. Had she known what was happening? Had she willingly participated in stealing Edward's work? Or had she been pressured by her department head? The letters suggested she'd cared about the research, had genuinely collaborated with Edward, but she'd also abandoned him when the university demanded it. On impulse, Thomas drafted an email. He kept it simple, professional, non-accusatory. He explained that he had acquired Edward Blackwell's farm, found correspondence between Edward and Dr. Waverly, discovered the workshop and the device. He said he had completed the prototype, and it worked exactly as Edward had described. He asked if she'd be willing to discuss Edward's contributions to energy research. He read the email 3 times before sending it, knowing it might accomplish nothing, might even be dangerous. But doing nothing felt like abandoning Edward all over again. The response came faster than Thomas expected, within 4 hours. Dr. Waverly's message was brief but emotional. She asked if they could speak by phone, provided her cell number, said she'd been carrying guilt about Edward for years. They talked that evening. Thomas sat on the farmhouse porch with his phone, watching darkness settle over the fields, while Dr. Waverly spoke from her office 300 miles away. "I think about him often," she said, her voice carrying weight accumulated over years. "The correspondence we had, those were some of the most intellectually exciting exchanges of my career. Edward was self-taught, but he had an intuitive grasp of systems that most trained engineers never develop." "What happened?" Thomas asked. A long pause. "Bernard Ashton happened. He was my department head, ambitious, always looking for the next big grant, the next publication that would elevate the program's reputation. I mentioned Edward's work in a faculty meeting, described some of his innovations. Bernard was immediately interested. He asked to see the correspondence, the designs. I thought he wanted to help, maybe bring Edward in as a consultant. But that's not what he wanted. No, the word was heavy with regret. He saw commercial potential, started talking about patents, about how the university could develop the technology, secure funding, build research programs around it. I tried to explain that these were Edward's ideas, that we couldn't just appropriate them. Bernard said Edward had no formal credentials, no institutional backing, no way to prove independent development. He said if we didn't move forward, someone else would, and at least we'd use the technology responsibly. "So you helped him steal it," Thomas said quietly. "I did." Her voice broke slightly. "I told myself I was being practical, that this was how academia worked, that Edward would never be able to navigate the patent process anyway. I rationalized every compromise until I didn't recognize myself anymore. When Edward reached out after the patent rejections, I was told not to respond. I should have fought harder. I should have done something." Thomas listened to her breathe on the other end of the line, gathering herself. "Bernard built his late career on that research," she continued. 3 patents, millions in grant funding, a named professorship. He retired 2 years ago, wealthy and celebrated. Meanwhile, Edward Blackwell died alone on a farm, his work uncredited, his genius unrecognized. "I've completed the device," Thomas said. "It works exactly as he designed it." Silence stretched between them. When Dr. Waverly spoke again, her voice was stronger. "I'll help however I can. I have documentation. Emails, internal memos, meeting notes. I kept everything. Maybe because some part of me knew this day would come. If you're planning to expose what happened, I'll testify. I'll provide evidence. It won't undo what I did, but it's something." They talked for another hour, developing a strategy. Dr. Waverly would compile her documentation, quietly send it to Thomas through secure channels. She'd reach out to colleagues who might support Edward's claim, people who valued truth over institutional loyalty. She warned that the university would fight back hard. Their reputation was at stake, along with the funding and prestige built on Bernard's research. "Are you prepared for that?" she asked. "They have lawyers' resources, the ability to make your life very difficult." Thomas looked out at the dark fields, at the barn, where Edward's workshop waited at the farm that had seemed like a cruel joke 6 months ago, but had become something else entirely. "I've got nothing to lose," he said, "and Edward deserves this. He deserves someone to fight for him." After they hung up, Thomas sat in the darkness for a long time. The scope of what he was undertaking they had expanded dramatically. This wasn't just about finishing a dead man's project anymore. It was about confronting institutional power, about challenging people who had every advantage, about demanding justice for someone who couldn't fight for himself. It was terrifying. It was probably foolish. But as Thomas sat there on Edward Blackwell's porch on land that now belonged to him through nothing but chance, he felt more certain of his purpose than he had in years. Tomorrow he'd call Phyllis's nephew, the attorney she'd mentioned. He'd start documenting everything systematically, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. He'd reach out to journalists, to advocacy groups, to anyone who might care that a brilliant man had been erased from his own story. The rain started then gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming on the roof. Thomas stayed on the porch, letting the sound wash over him, feeling cleansed by its persistence. Edward had built something that mattered. Now Thomas would make sure the world knew who built it. Lawrence Ketchum turned out to be exactly what Thomas needed, a lawyer who'd spent 40 years in corporate law and had no patience left for institutional dishonesty. He was 72, semi-retired, and when Thomas explained the situation over coffee at Phyllis's kitchen table, his eyes lit up with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from decades of watching powerful people get away with things. They did this to a man who had no resources to fight back, Lawrence said, reviewing the letters Thomas had brought. Classic institutional theft. They knew he couldn't afford legal representation, knew he'd be dismissed as a crank if he made accusations. So they took what they wanted and buried him in bureaucratic language. "Can we prove it?" Thomas asked. "With what you've got here, plus Dr. Waverly's testimony, yes, I think we can." Lawrence tapped the documents with one weathered finger. Patent law has provisions for challenging grants based on prior art and fraud. The fact that Edward's correspondence predates their filings by years is significant. The fact that Dr. Waverly will testify they used his designs, that's potentially explosive. Lawrence explained the process. They'd need to file formal challenges to the university's patents, provide evidence of Edward's prior invention, demonstrate that the university had knowledge of his work before filing their own claims. It would take months, maybe years. The university would fight with everything they had. "But here's the thing," Lawrence said, leaning forward. "Universities hate bad publicity more than they hate legal losses. If we can get media attention, show the human side of this story, a self-taught genius robbed of his life's work by the institution that should have championed him, they'll feel pressure to settle, especially if we can demonstrate that their celebrated research program was built on stolen foundations." "What do you need from me?" Thomas asked. "Everything. Every document, every blueprint, every journal entry. We build a timeline showing exactly when Edward developed each component, when he shared information with Dr. Waverly, when the university filed their patents. We make it so clear, so undeniable, that their only option is to acknowledge what they did." Thomas spent the next 2 weeks assembling a comprehensive evidence package. He photographed every page of Edward's journals, organized the letters chronologically, documented the device's construction with detailed images and technical specifications. Dr. Waverly sent encrypted files, meeting notes from 2007 that mentioned promising external research, emails where Bernard Ashton specifically asked about the Blackwell designs, internal memos discussing patent strategy. The case was building, but Lawrence emphasized they needed something more, something that would capture public attention, make people care about a man they'd never heard of. "We need to show them it works," Thomas said. "The device. We need to demonstrate that Edward's invention wasn't just theoretical. It's real, it's functional, and it could actually make a difference." Lawrence nodded slowly. "A public demonstration. Show the community, bring in media, let people see what Edward created. That makes it personal, makes it real. Then we release the story about what happened to him." They set a date 3 weeks out, enough to time it to spread the word, prepare the workshop, ensure everything was perfect. Thomas contacted Henrietta Bosch, a journalist at the county newspaper, who'd covered the raffle that had changed his life. She was immediately interested, saw the human interest angle, promised to bring a photographer and write a feature story. Word spread through town with the speed that only small-town networks achieve. Frank mentioned it to customers at the hardware store. Phyllis told her church group. Within days, people Thomas barely knew were stopping him to ask about the demonstration, about what Edward had built about this device that supposedly could change how rural communities access power. The attention made Thomas uncomfortable. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it for Edward. But Lawrence explained that public support would be crucial. The more people who care about this story, the harder it is for the university to dismiss or bury it, he said. Thomas called Emma to tell her about the demonstration. She answered on the third ring, sounding distracted as always. Dad, hi. What's going on? I wanted you to know I'm doing a public demonstration of Edward's device. 3 weeks from Saturday. Media will be there, probably a fair crowd from town. Silence on the other end. Then you're really doing this. You're actually going through with it. I am. Dad, this could backfire. What if people laugh? What if the device doesn't work the way you think it does? What if you just make yourself look foolish? Thomas felt the old frustration rising but pushed it down. It works, Emma. I've tested it dozens of times. And even if people laugh, Edward lived with their laughter for 30 years. If I can give him one day where people see him clearly, where they understand what he accomplished, it's worth it. You really care about this, I do. Why you never knew him. This isn't your fight. Thomas thought about how to answer that, about loneliness and purpose, about feeling invisible and finding meaning, about how honoring Edward's work had somehow restored his own sense of worth. Maybe it wasn't my fight at the beginning, he said finally, but it is now, and I could use your support. He heard her breathe, heard something shift in the silence. When did you say the demonstration was? 3 weeks from Saturday. 2 o'clock. I'll try to be there. You will. You're my father, and this clearly matters to you. So yes, I'll try. After they hung up, Thomas sat with the phone in his hand, feeling something cautiously close to hope. The rift between them hadn't magically healed, but maybe it had narrowed slightly. Maybe that was enough for now. The final 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Thomas cleaned the workshop until it gleamed organized displays showing the device's components, printed in large versions of key blueprints to mount on the walls. He tested the system repeatedly, verified every measurement, ensured there would be no failures during the demonstration. Frank gave him the day off work without being asked. This is important, he said simply. Go make your case. Phyllis helped spread the word through her networks. The church bulletin mentioned it. The community center posted notices. Local TV news picked up the story, a human interest piece about a reclusive inventor and the man trying to honor his legacy. The university got wind of it. Lawrence received a call from their legal department asking what Thomas was planning, warning that any claims of patent infringement would be met with legal action. Lawrence's response was measured but firm. Mr. Harper plans to demonstrate a device built by Edward Blackwell using Edward Blackwell's designs on Edward Blackwell's property. If that concerns the university, perhaps they should examine why. Dr. Waverly called Thomas 3 days before the demonstration. I'm coming, she said. I'll testify publicly if you want me to. It's time to tell the truth. The night before the demonstration, Thomas walked through the workshop one last time. Everything was ready. The device sat on its display stand, copper coils, polished connections secure, ready to prove what Edward had known all along. The walls were lined with evidence of 30 years of dedication. Blueprints, journals, photographs, the accumulated proof of genius dismissed and betrayed. Thomas thought about the man who'd built all this, who'd worked in solitude and died believing himself a failure. Tomorrow that narrative would change. Tomorrow the world would see Edward Blackwell, clearly would understand what had been lost when they'd laughed instead of listened. Tomorrow would vindicate Edward's life's work. Tomorrow would tell the truth that should have been told years ago. Tomorrow, justice, however imperfect, however late, would finally arrive. He just hoped it would be enough. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably warm October weather, the kind of day that felt like a gift. Thomas woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and spent the early hours making final preparations. He set up folding chairs borrowed from the community center, arranged them in rows facing the workshop entrance. He positioned the device where everyone could see it clearly, made sure the power meters were visible, double-checked every connection one last time. By noon, cars started arriving. Frank came first, helping Thomas set up a canopy in case the weather turned. Phyllis arrived with her church group, a dozen older folks who remembered Edward from town, who'd never known what he was working on out here. Mark and Patricia from the hardware store showed up curious and supportive. Neighbors Thomas barely knew pulled up the driveway, drawn by curiosity and the novelty of something actually happening in Miller Springs. The local TV crew arrived at 1:30, a young reporter named Kevin Marsh and a cameraman who looked barely out of college. Henrietta Bosch was already there, notebook in hand, asking Thomas questions about Edward's life, taking notes about everything. By 2 o'clock, more than 150 people had gathered. Folding chairs were all filled, people standing in the back, others sitting on the grass. Thomas had expected maybe 30. The turnout overwhelmed him, made him understand for the first time how many people were paying attention, how much this moment mattered. Emma arrived at 2:02, parking at the end of the long line of cars. Thomas saw her walking up the driveway, professional in her work clothes, looking uncertain and out of place among the farmers and townspeople. When their eyes met, she smiled, tentative but genuine. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. At 2:15, a rental car pulled up and Dr. Helen Waverly emerged. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, dressed, simply her face showing the strain of carrying guilt for years. Thomas walked over to greet her. She took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly. "For him, for the truth." Lawrence Ketchum stood and called for attention. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward the workshop entrance, where Thomas stood with the device visible behind him. "Thank you all for coming." Thomas began, his voice steadier than he felt. "6 months ago, I won this farm in a raffle. People laughed. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. The place was a wreck. I had no idea what I was doing here." He paused, looked out at the faces watching him. "But then I found something. I found the life's work of a man named Edward Blackwell." Thomas told the story simply, without embellishment. How he discovered the journal, the workshop, the device Edward had spent 30 years building. How he'd learned about Edward's dream of creating affordable power for rural communities, of proving that someone without credentials or institutional backing could still contribute something meaningful to the world. "Edward died 5 years ago," Thomas said. "He died believing he'd failed, that his work had been for nothing. But I'm here to show you that he didn't fail. He succeeded. He built something remarkable." Thomas stepped aside, revealing the device in full. The crowd leaned forward, studying the copper coils, the intricate components, the careful craftsmanship visible in every detail. "This is Edward's energy converter. It generates clean power with efficiency that exceeds anything commercially available. Let me show you how it works." He explained the principles in simple terms, how the system captured and converted energy, how the components worked together, what outputs could be expected. He showed them Edward's blueprints mounted on the walls, let them see the precision of his designs, the depth of his understanding. Then he powered it on. The device hummed to life, that distinctive sound Thomas had come to know so well. The copper coils began their measured rotation. Gauges flickered and steadied. The crowd watched in silence as numbers appeared on the display, voltage climbing, amperage stabilizing, frequency holding steady. Thomas had connected the output to a power strip with multiple appliances. Lights, a space heater, a small refrigerator, a power tool. He flipped switches and each device activated. The lights glowed bright. The heater began warming. The refrigerator's compressor kicked on. The power tool whirred to life. The power meter showed the device generating more energy than it consumed, operating with an efficiency that made several people gasp audibly. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. Brilliant and patient and real. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Thomas let the system run, let them see it, maintain steady output, prove its reliability. People stood for a better view, whispered to each other, pointed at the gauges and displays. After 10 minutes, Thomas shut the system down and turned to face the crowd. "Edward Blackwell built this, a self-taught mechanic from this town. A man you might have known, might have passed on the street, might have dismissed as odd or isolated. He created something that could genuinely help rural communities access affordable power. He should have been celebrated. Instead, he was robbed." The mood shifted, the celebration fading into something more serious. Thomas nodded to Lawrence, who stood with a folder of documents. What Mr. Harper hasn't told you yet, Lawrence said, is that Edward's work was stolen by State University. He shared his designs with faculty. They sought their expertise, trusted them to help protect his invention. Instead, they took his ideas, filed their own patents, built research programs, and secured millions in funding based on technology Edward created. And they let him die believing he had failed. The crowd stirred, angry murmurs spreading. Lawrence outlined the evidence. The dated correspondence, the timeline showing Edward's work predating the university's patents, the internal documents proving they had had access to his designs. Then Dr. Waverly stood. Thomas hadn't asked her to speak, but she walked to the front and faced the crowd with the demeanor of someone confessing. My name is Dr. Helen Waverly. I was Edward's collaborator, and I betrayed him. Her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. I corresponded with Edward for years. He shared everything with me, his calculations, his designs, his dreams. When my department head saw commercial potential in his work, I was pressured to provide access to everything. I told myself I was being practical, that this was how academia worked. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I helped steal from a man who trusted me. She described what had happened, confirmed Lawrence's account, admitted her complicity. I've carried guilt about this for years. Nothing I do now can give Edward back what was taken from him. But I can tell the truth. I can say publicly that State University's celebrated energy research was built on stolen foundations. That Edward Blackwell was the true innovator. And we erased him from his own story. The crowd was silent now, absorbing the weight of what they were hearing. Kevin Marsh's cameraman filmed everything. Henrietta's pen flew across her notebook. An unexpected voice spoke from the back. Phyllis standing with her cane, her voice wavering but clear. I knew Edward for 30 years. He was kind. He helped my husband with metalwork projects, never asked for anything in return. We never knew what he was building out here, but we knew he was a good man. This town treated him like he was strange, like he didn't matter. Turns out he mattered more than any of us knew. Others stood, then sharing small memories. The mechanic who remembered Edward fixing a complicated engine problem no one else could solve. The librarian who recalled him reading engineering textbooks for hours, always polite, always curious. People who'd seen Edward around town for decades but never really seen him at all. The pattern emerged clearly. A brilliant, kind man rendered invisible by a community that didn't understand him, then actively harmed by institutions that should have protected his work. Thomas watched it all, felt the narrative shift happening in real time. This wasn't just about a device anymore. It was about dignity, about recognition, about saying clearly that Edward Blackwell mattered, that his life had meaning, that the truth deserved to be told regardless of who it embarrassed or what institutions it challenged. When the demonstration officially ended, people didn't leave. They clustered in small groups discussing what they'd seen, what they'd learned. Many approached Thomas to thank him, to say they wished they'd known Edward better, to express support for whatever came next. Emma found him as the crowd thinned. She looked at him with eyes that held something new. Not pity or worry, but respect. Dad, you did something important today. You gave that man his dignity back. You proved that his work mattered. Thomas pulled her into a hug, felt her arms tighten around him. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. I'm proud of you, she said simply. Those 4 words, more than anything else that had happened that day, made Thomas feel like he'd finally done something right. The demonstration's aftermath moved faster than Thomas anticipated. By Sunday morning, the local news segment had been shared thousands of times online. By Monday, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists from regional papers, bloggers covering technology and innovation, even a producer from a national morning show, asking if he'd be willing to appear via satellite. Thomas declined most interviews, redirected them to Lawrence, or suggested they contact Dr. Waverly. This wasn't about him becoming famous. It was about Edward getting recognition. But the attention was building, creating momentum that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The university's legal team called at 9:30 Tuesday morning. Lawrence had Thomas and Emma on speakerphone in his office when the call came through. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss resolution, the lead counsel said, her voice professionally neutral. Would your clients be available this Thursday? Lawrence glanced at Thomas, who nodded. We can make that work, your office or ours. We'd prefer neutral ground. There's a conference facility midway between our locations. We'll send details. After the call ended, Lawrence leaned back in his chair. They're ready to negotiate. The media pressure worked. They want this settled before it gets worse. Thursday arrived cold and gray, threatening snow. Thomas wore his only suit bought for his wife's funeral 7 years ago. Emma drove her professional demeanor, settling over her like armor. Lawrence sat in the back reviewing documents one final time. The conference facility was modern and anonymous, the kind of place where corporations settled disputes away from public scrutiny. The university's team was already there. 3 attorneys, a public relations director, and Dr. Marcus Pritchard, the current department head, who'd inherited the energy research program built on Edward's stolen work. Dr. Waverly arrived separately, having driven 4 hours to be present. Her inclusion had been Thomas's condition. If they were going to discuss Edward's contributions, the person who'd worked most closely with him deserved to be there. The meeting started with forced pleasantries, then moved quickly to business. The university's lead counsel opened with their position. They acknowledged that Edward had corresponded with faculty, that some technical exchange had occurred. They were prepared to offer compensation and appropriate recognition of Edward's contributions. "That's insufficient," Lawrence said calmly. "Your patents are based directly on Mr. Blackwell's designs. You filed those patents knowing they were derived from his work. We're not asking for appropriate recognition. We're demanding full acknowledgement that Edward Blackwell was the original inventor." The negotiation continued for 3 more hours. Every word scrutinized, every phrase debated. But the fundamental agreement held. Edward would be acknowledged as the original inventor. The scholarship would be established. Thomas's prototype was protected. As evening approached and the final language was being drafted, Thomas excused himself and stepped outside. Snow fell steadily, now silent and cleansing. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph he'd saved. Edward standing beside his device, that slight smile suggesting secrets and satisfaction. "We did it," Thomas whispered to the image. "Your name will be remembered. Your work will be credited. You didn't fail, Edward. You succeeded." The final settlement documents were signed at 7:30 that evening. Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name, the weight of what they'd accomplished settling over him like the snow outside. Emma signed as witness, then Lawrence, then Dr. Waverly. The university representatives added their signatures with expressions that mixed relief and resignation. The drive home felt surreal. Emma navigated the snowy roads carefully while Thomas sat in the passenger seat, exhausted and oddly empty. He'd expected to feel triumphant, but instead felt only a quiet satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness that Edward hadn't lived to see this day. "You okay, Dad?" Emma asked. "Just tired, and thinking about how Edward should be here. He is, in a way. Everything you did was for him. He's present in that." 3 months later, spring arrived at the farm with a gentleness that felt like benediction. The university ceremony took place in March. A bronze plaque now hung in the laboratory entrance with Edward's photograph and an inscription recognizing his contributions. The scholarship had been awarded to its first recipient, a 19-year-old woman named Maya Blackstone, from a farming community 2 counties over. She taught herself advanced mathematics, working in her family's equipment. She dreamed of studying renewable energy, but couldn't afford university tuition. Now she'd attend on a full scholarship bearing Edward's name. Thomas had met her briefly at the ceremony. She'd gripped his hand with calloused fingers and said thank you for fighting for him. "People like us, we need to know that someone who started like we did can accomplish something that matters." The farm had become something unexpected. People started visiting to see Edward's workshop. Engineering students, journalists writing follow-up pieces, families from town who'd never thought to visit while Edward was alive but came now to pay respects to his memory. Thomas gave tours twice monthly, never charging admission. Edward had wanted his work to help people. Thomas honored that by keeping it accessible. Emma had made changes too. She'd resigned from her pharmaceutical sales position and was exploring opportunities that felt more meaningful. She spent most weekends at the farm, helping Thomas develop educational programming, thinking about how to expand Edward's legacy. One evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the fields, Gold Emma said, "I've been thinking about starting a foundation. Something that supports rural innovators, provides resources and protection. So what happened to Edward doesn't happen to others." Thomas looked at his daughter, seeing determination that reminded him of her mother. Edward would love that. Using his work to protect other people's work. That's exactly right. On a warm April morning, Thomas commissioned a second plaque for the workshop. He mounted it beside the first where morning sunlight would illuminate both. The new inscription read, "Dedicated to all the brilliant minds working in obscurity. Your contributions matter. Your efforts count. Your genius deserves recognition. Keep building. Someone will notice. Someone will care." That afternoon, Thomas sat in the workshop with Edward's journal open to the final pages where he had been adding his own entries. He wrote April 20th, 6 months since I started this journey. Edward's name is restored. His scholarship is funding its first student. His device is moving toward production. The workshop has become a gathering place, a reminder that innovation can happen anywhere, that credentials matter less than dedication. I came to this farm with nothing. No job, no purpose, no hope. Edward's work gave me all three. More than that, it gave me back my daughter, my sense of worth, my belief that one person can make a difference. To whoever continues this work after me, honor the past, but build toward the future. Edward showed us how. Now it's our turn to carry it forward. Thomas closed the journal and placed it carefully on the shelf where it belonged. Not hidden, but preserved, available to anyone who wanted to understand the full story. He looked around the workshop at the device still humming its steady rhythm, at the walls lined with blueprints and photographs, at the space where Edward had spent 30 years turning vision into reality. The brass plaques gleamed in afternoon light. Edward's photograph watched from the wall with that slight smile, as if he'd known all along that someone would eventually understand, would eventually care, would eventually fight to tell the truth. Thomas walked outside into spring sunshine. The fields stretched green and growing. The barn stood straight, repaired and functional. The farmhouse that had seemed like a cruel joke when he'd won it now felt like home, the place where his life had been restored through honoring another man's legacy. Emma's car pulled up the driveway. She got out carrying groceries, waving at her father with genuine happiness on her face. They'd cook dinner together, sit on the porch talking as stars emerged, make plans for the foundation and the workshop and all the work still ahead. Thomas smiled, feeling contentment settle over him like the warm spring air. Life had given him a worthless farm and turned it into treasure. Loss had transformed into purpose. Isolation had become connection. A $5 raffle ticket had led him to Edward Blackwell, and through Edward, back to himself. Sometimes endings are beginnings. Sometimes what people throw away is exactly what someone else needs to find. Sometimes justice arrives late, but arrives nonetheless. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, you get the chance to honor a stranger's life and discover your own purpose in the process. The device hummed in the workshop. Edward's name lived on bronze plaques and scholarship documents. And Thomas Harper, once invisible and defeated, stood on his farm watching his daughter approach, knowing that he'd done something that mattered. He'd given a forgotten man his rightful place in history, and in doing so, he'd found his own.